Alright then my friends, so now we have our coding environment all set up. Hopefully you've got VS Code installed on your computer and that package, Live Server, because we're going to be using this to preview our pages in the browser. I've already gone ahead and right clicked and gone to open with Live Server so we can preview the website right here. There's nothing there at the minute, but that's because we have no content in the page. But if we had an H1 over here that says page title, save that, and view over here, now we can see that, okay? So what I'd like to do now is show you how to add JavaScript to a web page and where we add that JavaScript. So first of all, where? Where do we add JavaScript to an HTML page? Well, we can add it anywhere between the head tags or anywhere between the body tags. So for example, I could come beneath the title and add some JavaScript right here. Now the first thing to do is create a script tag like so, and we place our JavaScript between those tags. So I could say something like alert and then hello world semicolon, and I don't expect you to understand what this means at the minute. This is just some random JavaScript to demo where to place it on your page, okay? But if I save this now, then this script is going to run, and this thing right here, this alert function, this creates a pop-up on the screen. So if I save it, go to the browser, we see that pop-up, hello world, we press OK, and the rest of the page loads. Now, placing a script inside a head, that's absolutely fine. You can do that, but in some cases, it's going to cause some loading issues. So 99% of the time, if you're adding JavaScript to a page, I would do it not here, but instead at the bottom of the body tag, just before the closing body tag right there. Place that in and scoot it back. If I save this, it's going to do exactly the same thing. We see the pop-up, okay, and then the page loads, okay? So this is fine when you have a small amount of JavaScript, but if you have a large amount of JavaScript with different functions and it goes on and on and on in this page, then it would be better to somehow externalize that JavaScript and put it in a separate file. Then just link to that file from the HTML page. This is a bit like when you do CSS, right? If you wanted to, you could add a load of CSS in the head in some style tags, but most of the time when we have a lot of CSS, instead we do a link tag and link to an external CSS file. So that's what I'm going to do most of the time inside this course, probably 99.9% of the time in fact. So I'm going to comment this out, and instead I'm going to link to an external file. So I'll create that file first of all, right click over here, go to new file, and we'll call this sandbox.js. So all JavaScript files have this .js extension, that's important. So now we can link to this file from index. Let's come down here. We still need our script tags right here. This time we say source is equal to, and then the path to this file. So it's just sandbox.js. Okay? So now we have that linked up. If we write some JavaScript code inside this file, it's going to run that when we load this page in the browser. Now over here, we don't need to do any more script tags. The script tags are right here. Okay, so we can just write our JavaScript directly in this file now. So I could do exactly the same thing, alert, then hello world, and then close that off with a semicolon, save, and come over here, and it does exactly the same thing. Okay, so this is how we're going to be working in this series, in this course. We're going to be linking to our scripts from the bottom of the body tag to an external file. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to mention, and that is that in JavaScript, we use semicolons like this to mark the end of a statement. So this right here, this is a JavaScript statement, and this semicolon is marking the end of it. It's like a full stop at the end of a sentence. It's our way of ending a line of code that does something. Imagine having a book, and that book had no full stops or periods. Then you would not know when to take a breather, right? So that's the case in JavaScript as well. This marks the end of a particular statement. Now technically, in a lot of cases, if you forget your semicolon, then the code will still work and it's not going to give you an error. They're not required a lot of the time. So if I delete that and save, then preview this in the browser, everything still works, right? Now, there are some developers who don't use them at all, but in some cases, if you don't use them, then you will get an error. And I think especially when you're first starting and you don't know the language that well or why you would be getting an error, it's always a good habit to get into to add your semicolons at the end of a statement, okay? And we'll talk more about this as we go along in the course. So anyway, there we go. That's how we add JavaScript to a web page. So then, for this course, I'm using Google Chrome as my browser of choice. Hopefully you are too. It comes with some developer tools and a console, which will really help us a lot when working with JavaScript. Now you can open up the tools panel by pressing F12 inside your browser, and that opens on the console tab right here. So the console is like a sandbox area in a browser, which we can use to test JavaScript code. We can print out values and basically just play around in it. So I could type some JavaScript code directly inside here and just press enter to run it. For example, we'll do alert again. Alert and just say hello and then press enter, and it's going to run that JavaScript for us. So it's a nice little area to play around with some code when we're learning. Now we can also log things to the console, this thing right here, from our JavaScript file. So say for example I wanted to output some kind of value over here in the console when this JavaScript file is run. I can do that. I can do that by just saying console.log and then in parentheses what I would like to log to the console. So for example, I could just say 1 and then end this statement with a semicolon. Save it and come over here and we can see this 1 value over here. Now if we wanted to add something else, we could just come below and say console.log and then 2. And this is going to run in order because JavaScript runs from top to bottom. So it's going to log this first, then this. So if we save that and preview, we can see 1, then 2. Now, don't get too hung up about what this all means, like dot right here and this log function and the console. Don't worry too much about it just yet. We're going to cover all this kind of stuff later on. Just know that this is a function right here that we can use to log out values to the console. And that is really going to help us when we're learning the language. So for the first few chapters of this course, while we learn the building blocks of the language, we'll be using this console to test our code and see some results. And then later in the course, when we've learned all of the basics, we'll move on to manipulating content in the browser itself, in a web page, and other cool things too. Now, if you're not using Google Chrome, then shame on you, but most likely the browser that you have has some kind of console. In Firefox, you can open this by pressing Ctrl plus Shift plus K, and in Internet Explorer, use F12 to open up the DevTools, then hit the console tab at the top to see the console, okay? So now we know how to use this console over here and how we can log to the console from our JavaScript file. In the next video, I want to move on and talk about some of the most basic concepts in the language, variables and constants. So then, one of the most fundamental things in JavaScript is this notion of variables. And what variables do is give us a way to store a value like a name or a number or an email, and then use that value whenever we want to later on in the file. Now there's a few different ways we can make a variable. The first way to create one is by using the let keyword. So that would look something like this. We say let, then the variable name, for example age, and we set that equal to something. So I'm going to set it equal to 25, then we end this with a semicolon, okay? So you can think of this as saying let this variable called age be equal to the value of 25. Now this value is now stored in memory and we can access it later on using this variable name. So I could just come down here and I could say console.log and then the age variable, which is what we called it, and that's going to log this to the console. So if I save and check it out in a browser, we see 25, okay? All right, then let's do another example. I'll say let year equal to 2019, and we're going to save that. And we want to log this to the console as well. Now, I could duplicate this onto the next line, but in one console log statement, we can actually output several values. And we do that by separating them with a comma. So I could just say age, comma, then year, and that's going to output both of these values. So if I save now, preview, we can see 25, then 2019, okay? So this let keyword right here creates us a variable, and if we want to override the value of those variables later on, we can do. So I could come down here and I could say age is now equal to 30. And what that's going to do is look at where we initially defined age, grab that value and update it so that age is now equal to 30. We don't have to say let anymore. We just take the variable that's already been defined and change the value. So now if I say console.log and then age underneath, hopefully we should see 25 to begin with. Then we reset the value of the variable, then this should be 30. So save it and preview, and we see 25, 2019, and then 30. Cool. Okay then, so what if we wanted to create a variable, but we don't want the value of that variable to be able to change? Well, in this case, we'd use a different keyword than let. We'd use the const keyword. So let's now do another variable, but this time use const, and this creates us a constant. We still give this a name, so I'll call this points, for example, and set it equal to something. I'll say 100. And this creates a variable much in the same way as the let keyword does, and we can log it to the console. So I'll say console.log and then points, and we're still going to see that over here. We can see 100. But now if I try to override this value the same way we did with this, then it's not going to let me. If I say points is now equal to something else like 50, save it, then we get an error over here. We see assignment to constant variable. We're not allowed to do that. We use a constant if we don't want this value to be overridden by mistake at any point. Okay, so something that's going to stay the same throughout the whole program. Now, both of these keywords, const and let, they are fairly new additions to the JavaScript language. They're the modern way to create variables, and they're what I would recommend using almost 100% of the time. Now, I will generally use let if I think I might change the value of the variable at some point, or sometimes when I know that I don't want to change or overwrite the value of a variable, I'll use const instead. But there is another older keyword that we can use to create variables too, and that is the var keyword. Okay, so before let and const came about, this is what we'd use. Now I'm just going to do a quick demo and show you this. So I'm going to say var, then name this variable score and set it equal to 75. Then I'm going to say console.log score. So this should still work in exactly the same way. I'm going to get rid of this thing where I try to override the value of points so we don't get the error. Save it. And down here we can still see that score. Okay, 75. So this right here, this var keyword, this is the older way to create variables before let and const came about. Now you still will see some developers use this, but in this course, because we're doing a modern JavaScript course, I'm just going to be using const and let, okay? I just wanted to let you know about that older way of creating them. So then, when we give our variables, either let or const down here, different names, these are the names of the variables, there are a few different constraints. First of all, there can't be any spaces. We can't say something like my space age, okay? It has to be one complete word. Typically, if we want to use two or more words in a variable, we use something called camel case, which is something like this. My, and then we start the next word with a capital letter, my age. And it's called camel case because it looks like the hump in a camel's back, all right? So that's the first constraint. We can't use spaces. Now the second one, variables can contain only letters, numbers, underscores, or dollar signs, but they can't start with a number. They can start with any of those other things I just said, underscore or dollar, for example, but they can't start with a number. So I can't say 5 age. Notice we get that squiggle line, okay? And finally, there's also some reserved keywords in JavaScript that we can't use for variables because they're used for other things. For example, let and const. So I couldn't create a variable that's called const, right? That won't work because this is a reserved keyword in JavaScript for creating constants. So what I'm going to do is leave a document attached to this lecture, which is going to outline all of those different reserved keywords. So you can check those out for yourself. So that's just a few constraints when we're naming these variables. Also, when you do name things, try to make the name meaningful so that if another developer looked at your work, they would say, yeah, I understand what this is meant to represent. Okay, so one last thing in this video I'd like to show you, and that is comments. So say, for example, I want to make some kind of comment in this code for another developer when they come to read this file. I could do that. I could say something like this, log things to console. And that right here is grayed out. This is a comment, and it's a one-line comment, and I did that by adding 2 forward slashes at the start. So when JavaScript runs this file, it's not going to run any comments. I can also use these to comment out certain things, like this. If I just want to test something with a console log, but then don't use it later on, I can comment it out, and now this is not going to run. So that's how to do a single line comment using double forward slash. I can also do a multi-line comment by saying forward slash and then asterisk, and then we need to close this off at the end of the comment like so. And we could place it somewhere else. We could place it up here. And then all of this is commented out as well, okay? So that's just a couple of ways to comment things out. Also, there is a keyboard shortcut. I could highlight something I want to comment out and press Control and forward slash, and it's going to comment those out. I can do the same thing to uncomment those as well, all right? Now, there is just one final thing, I promise, in this video I want to tell you about, and that is when we're using modern JavaScript techniques like let and const and other things in the future, they might not work in 100% of browsers out there. Old browsers like Internet Explorer 11 and things like that, they don't support a lot of the modern features. So I would strongly suggest that you use something like Google Chrome as your browser for this course. In one of the last chapters, we are going to look at supporting all browsers using things like Babel. But for now, I would recommend using something like Google Chrome for the rest of this course. Okay then, so we've seen how to store different data or values in variables. We saw that in the last video. But at the minute, all of those different values were just numbers. We did things like an age, a year, or points, or a score. They were all numbers, right? And that is just one data type in JavaScript. Now in JavaScript, we work with many different data types. There's 7 in total. They're all listed here, and they all have their own unique properties and the things that they can do. So we're going to have a quick run through of all of them now, but as we go into the course, we'll be looking at each one in much more detail and using them all as we go through them. So then first of all, numbers. We've seen them in action already. Things like 1, 2, 3, 100 or 3.14, even decimals like this. They are all of the number type. The next one right here, this is a string, and strings are basically a series of characters in single or double quotes, like a sentence or some kind of email, like this, okay? The next one, booleans over here, they are a special logical true or false value, not in quotes, they're not strings, and we use these for evaluating conditions. Now this next one, null over here, this is a way that we can explicitly say that a variable has no value. So we could create a variable, but set it equal to null to say that that variable doesn't have a real value yet. Okay, now it's closely related to undefined here, but the difference is undefined is a type that's given to variables automatically by the browser that have not yet been defined. So these are both empty values, but this one right here, null, we explicitly set to a variable. This one is automatically given to variables when they're not yet defined. Does that make sense? Okay, so the next type, this object thing right here, these are more complex data structures which can have multiple different properties and functions, meaning they can perform various different things. Now, a lot of JavaScript is based around using objects, and there are many different object types or types of objects built into the language which we can use out of the box. There's a whole subset of built-in object types like arrays, dates, object literals. In fact, you might hear the saying everything in JavaScript is an object, which is a huge simplification, but it stems from a source of truth. But don't worry about that now. There will be a whole chapter on objects later on in the course, and we will look at all the different types of objects we can use in JavaScript as well. Things like arrays and dates and object literals, okay? And finally, symbols, they are a new addition to the JavaScript language, which are closely linked to objects too, so we're going to discuss them more later in the course rather than now. So for the rest of this chapter, we're going to be looking at these different types of data. Strings, numbers, null, undefined, and booleans. We'll also have a quick look at arrays, which fall under the object type down here. It's a type of object with its own unique properties, but we use them all the time in JavaScript, and they're quite simple to learn, which is why I'm covering them in this chapter. Now, a variable, which we've already seen, can hold any data type, be it a string, a number, null, boolean, an object, etc. We don't have to explicitly say what type of variable it will store, or what type of data it will store. And we can override a variable with a different type too, meaning if we make a variable and store a string in it to begin with, we can override it later on if we use the let keyword, that is, with a number. Okay, so we can change the type of variables. And for that reason, JavaScript is known as a loosely typed language, in contrast to a strongly typed language like Ruby or Python. Now, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed with all the different types or think you have to remember them all. Don't focus on that, because the more you code with JavaScript, it's going to come naturally to you over time. And we're going to be referring back to this type chart anyway throughout the course to reinforce your understanding of them. The last thing I want to do is scare you off, so as long as we have that idea of types simmering in the background, that is more than good enough for now. So then, the first data type I want to explore in more depth are strings. So we use strings to store letters, numbers, or other characters, and we could use them to store something like a name or an email address or something like that. So what I'll do is just log to the console a simple string. So I'm going to say console.log, and remember, we store strings in either single quotes or double quotes. Now, they behave the same way. It doesn't matter which one you use, but if you open with a single quote, you close it with a single quote. If you open with a double, you close it with a double. I generally use single quotes for strings, but sometimes you might see me use double quotes if I need to. So I'm just going to say hello world and put my semicolon on and save this. And we should see this logged to the console. Now, we don't see the quotes right here, but that doesn't matter. Over here, we add quotes to make a string, okay? So then we can also store strings inside variables. So I could say let email equal to some kind of string, for example, mario@thenetninja.co.uk. And now that is stored in this email variable. So if I wanted to, I could log this to the console by saying console.log and then email. So if I save this, we should see both of those things now logged to the console. Cool. Okay then, so imagine we had two strings and we wanted to join them together. Well, that is called concatenation. So concatenation is just a fancy word for joining things together. So if we had two variables, for example, let first name equal to Brandon, and then we'll say let last name equal to Sanderson. What I want to do is join these two different strings together. Now I can say let full name equal to first name plus last name. So this is string concatenation. We use a plus sign to concatenate one string to another string. In other words, to join one string to another string. So if I say console.log full name now, then we should see this in the console. Now, if we take a look over here, we can see Brandon Sanderson, but there's no space in between the two names. So what we could do is concatenate after the first name a string, which is just a space. Then we concatenate the last name. So we're concatenating three different things here. The first name, then a string, which is just a space, then the last name. So now, if we save this, we can see Brandon Sanderson with a space in between. Okay, so we can do this kind of thing. So we can also extract a single character from a string that we have stored, for example, this one, by using square bracket notation. So I'll show you what that means. I'm just going to say console.log first of all, then we're going to take the full name and say, for example, I want the first letter in that name. Then I can use square brackets and I pass in 0. Now we pass in 0 because JavaScript is a zero-based language, meaning it counts from 0 up rather than 1 up. So in JavaScript, this is position 0, the first letter. The second one is position 1, then 2, then 3, so forth. Okay, so 0 actually gets me the first character. So this is why we use square brackets after a string, to get a single character in a particular position. So this should get me B, and we should see that in the console. Cool. Now if I wanted to change this to another, I could say 2, and that should get me the A, because 0, 1, 2. So if I save it, preview, we see A. Okay, so that's how we get a single character using this square bracket notation on a string. Now, a string also has methods and properties. Now, one such property is the string length. So we could say something like this, console.log, and find the length of the string, that is how many characters are inside the string, by saying full name dot length. And that gets us the length of this string right here. So if I save, we see 17. And if we were to count the characters, which I'm not going to do, we would find that there's 17 characters. And this right here, this is one of them at space. Okay? So that's the length property. And finally, strings have several different functions associated with them. Now, these functions are called methods. And there is a technical difference between functions and methods, but you're going to hear them used interchangeably. So basically, a function is a snippet of code which performs some kind of specific task. A method is just a function that's associated with a particular object or data type. And we're going to discuss the technical differences later on, but the two words essentially mean the same thing. So if I say method or function, they both mean that we're performing some kind of function that does something. And a string has several methods, several functions that can do things, okay? So for example, we have a method called toUpperCase, and what that does is take the string and it turns it so that all the letters are uppercase. So I could say something like console.log, we do the string we want to use the method on, so full name, then we say dot, and we say toUpperCase. So this is the method name. So when we have properties, we say dot and then the property name, but this isn't a function. This is just a property of the string. It's not actually performing some kind of snippet of code to do something. It's just finding out a property of the string. This down here, toUpperCase, this is a method, a function which actually does something. It takes our full name and it turns it to uppercase. So because this is a method, what we do is add brackets or parentheses on the end of it. So whenever you see something like this, dot and then some kind of name and then parentheses, it means that this is a method of whatever we're using it on. Okay, in this case, it's a string method. So if we save this now, we're going to see that it's going to take our full name, our string, and it's going to turn it to uppercase, and then we're going to log that to the console. So we can see now Brandon Sanderson in all uppercase. Okay. Now there are other methods as well. I'm going to show you another, and this time what I want to do is store a result inside a variable. So I'll say let result equal to full name dot to lowercase. Okay. Now what this does is the opposite. It takes the full name and it's going to turn it to lowercase, but instead of logging this to the console like we did up here, what we're doing is actually taking the value that this gives back to us and we're storing it in a value called result, a variable, okay? Then what we could do is use this later on. For now, we are just going to log this to the console, console.log. I just wanted to show you that we can store the values that are returned to us right here. So I can say results like so. Save it, and we can see this in the console. Now it's all lowercase. Before, up here, normally it started with a capital, both names, but now it's all lowercase. Now, I want to make one thing clear. These methods right here, they don't actually alter the variables themselves, the original variable, this full name. So if I was to log out the full name as well, we're going to see that it's still going to be Brandon Sanderson like this, capitalized. So if I save it, preview it in a browser, we can see that we get this one right here, Brandon Sanderson, with just a capital letter at the start of each name. So these methods, they do not actually alter the original value that we use them on. Now, some methods do alter the original value and some methods don't. So these are just cases where they don't alter the original value. Now, sometimes we can use methods which expect us to give them a certain value. So for example, I'm going to use another method down here, but before I do that, I'm going to say let index equal to the email. I remember that email value was this thing up here. We said email is equal to mario@thenetninja.co.uk. So I'm creating a variable called index. I'm setting it equal to email dot index of. So this is a method, and it's going to find the index of a certain character inside this string. So by index, I mean the position. So what I want to do is tell it to find the index of the @ symbol. Okay, so I can pass in as a string, in quotes, the @ symbol to this method. Now this thing right here, this is called an argument, but you might also hear them being called parameters, including when I talk about them because they're easy words to get mixed up. But technically speaking, when we pass a value into a method like this, this is an argument, okay? So what that's going to do is find the index of this inside that string, email, and it's going to return that value to us, which we're then storing inside this variable. So now if I say console.log and then the index, like so, I'm going to save it, come over here, and we can see 5. Now if we count them, 0 for the first position, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. Okay, so it gets us that index. So then, the takeaway points here are that strings are a series of letters or numbers, and by the way, we can add numbers in here, that's a valid string. Any kind of character we want to in here, that's absolutely fine. These just all go inside quotes. So, strings are a series of letters, numbers, and characters in quotes. They have properties like the length, and we use dot notation to get those properties. They also have methods, which are the same kind of thing as functions. They're built-in snippets of code that do things for us, and we denote methods and call them by using these parentheses at the end of them. So strings have methods as well as properties. And we're going to explore some more string methods in the very next video. Alright then my friends, so we've already seen a few basic string methods in the last video, and remember, methods are just functions that belong to a specific object or object type. Now let's have a look at some more methods. So, first of all, I'm going to create a new variable called email and set that equal to mario@thenetninja.co.uk. And let's spell this correctly. Okay, so now let's use some methods on this variable right here. So the first one I'm going to show you is called lastIndexOf. Now I'm going to store the results in a variable called result and set this equal to email.lastIndexOf. So we're using this method on the email, which is the string, and this method finds us the last index of a particular character in that string. So for example, say I want to find the last instance of, I don't know, something like n. Then we pass that in there as a string, right? The string is the argument. That's going to find us the position of the last n it comes across inside this string, which is this. So the position of this n. So now let's come down here and say console.log result, just to see if this works. And we'll preview this in a browser. And we can see 14. Let's just quickly count. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Spot on. Okay, so that works. All right, let me comment this out and let's move on to the next one. So next, I'd like to do a method called slice. And what slice does is essentially slice a section from the string. So let's do this. We'll say let result this time equal to the email, which is the string, dot slice, and inside we pass in 2 arguments this time, not just one like we have been doing up here, now 2 arguments. Now the first argument is where we want to slice from. So if we want to slice from the beginning, we say position 0. The next argument is where we want to slice to. So if we want to slice to position 10, we say position 10. And if we save that, we're still logging out the result, which is this over here. So let's save it, view in a browser, and we can see this. Okay, so it slices that section from 0 to position 10, and it logs that to the console now when we do it here. So let's change this to 5, and we should just get the first 5 letters, which is Mario. Cool. So remember, the first argument is where we go from, the second argument is where we go to. Okay, so we could do this if we wanted to, from 2 to 5, and we get something like Rio. All right then. So the next one I'd like to show you is similar to slice, and we'll set result equal to this. So let result equal to email dot substr, so substring. And what we're going to be doing with this is making a substring from this. It's very much like slice, but the 2 arguments represent something slightly different. So the first one is still the start position. So if I say 0, I'm saying start from position 0. But this time, the second argument is how many characters we want to go along. So if I say 10, then it's going to get us the first 10, right? Which is the same as 0 to 10 here. But if I say 4 to 10, then it's going to go from position 4 and it's going to carry on 14. So I'm going to save this now and let's view this in a browser. And now we can see it goes from position 4 up to position 14. It gets 10 characters, okay? So that's the difference between these 2 methods. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. I'll say let result equal to email, and this time we'll use a method called replace. Now what replace does is replace a certain character in the string with another character. So it takes two arguments. I'm going to say M, and if I pass in the second argument to be W, then what it's going to do is find the first M inside this string and replace it with a W. Now the first M is right here, so let's save this and test it. And we can see now we get Wario at the Net Ninja. So it's replaced that first M. Cool. Okay then, so let's do another example of this method. What I'm going to do is say this time let results equal to email.replace, and we're going to replace this time N with W. So what do you think is going to happen here? Because we have several N's. We have this one, and this one. Well, if I save it, let's have a look. And we can see Mario at thewetninja.co.uk. So it's only replaced the first N right here. So that's what this replace function does. When we just pass it in a simple string like this, it replaces the first one it comes to with this. We can use this with regular expressions to do something a little bit different, but since we've not touched on those yet, we'll leave that for later. Now there are some other string methods that I do want to show you, but we're going to be looking at those as we carry on through the course. Okay then, so now we've seen strings in more detail, let's shift our focus now to another data type in JavaScript, that is numbers. So we have also briefly seen numbers in action when we looked at variables. We did things like storing age or a year or a score in a variable, and they were all numbers, weren't they? Now we could use numbers for various things in JavaScript, like an age or a score, or how many upvotes a blog post might have, for example, or to perform some kind of calculation. So there's loads of uses for numbers in JavaScript, so let's have a look at them in action. First of all, I'm going to create two variables. I'm going to use let for the first one, and this is called radius, and that's set equal to 10. Now I'm going to create a constant called pi because I don't see myself changing this. I don't want to change it. It's a constant, and that is 3.14. So pi is a special value in maths used to calculate the area of a circle, and the radius is just the radius of the circle. So we have those two variables, which are both numbers. Let's just log them to the console. So we'll say console.log, and then we want the radius and also pi. So let's save that and see if it works. There we go, 10 and 3.14. So these are both numbers. This is a whole number, this is a decimal number, but they're still both numbers, the same data type in JavaScript. Okay? So then what can we do with numbers? Well, we can do all the typical math operations. So let me just write these down first of all. Math operators, and that is a plus, a minus, a multiplication, which is an asterisk, a division, which is a forward slash. Then we have double asterisk, which means to the power of, and then we have percentage, which gets us a remainder. So let's have a look at some of these. First of all, I'm going to console.log, and I'm just going to say 10 divided by 2. Okay, now we don't need these spaces that I've just put in there. I've done that so it's easier to see. And this should get us 5, right? And it does. It performs that calculation and then spits out the result. So that's pretty simple. Now, what if we do something like this? I'm going to say let result equal to the radius, which we have at the top, it's 10. And I'm going to use the percentage 3. So what this does is get us the remainder of a calculation. It takes the radius, divides it by 3, and then gives us the remainder, which should be 1. So let's log this to the console.log, and we want to log out the result variable that we just created right here, which is storing the result of this calculation. It should be 1. That is the remainder, and it is 1. Cool. Okay, so now let me comment this out, and in fact, I'll comment this one out as well. And let's do another. This time we'll say let result equal to the pi, which is 3.14, times the radius to the power of 2. So that is the formula for working out the area of a circle. So we're saying the result is pi r squared. This is the squared bit to the power of 2, okay? So it's the radius times the radius. So let's save that, and we're logging out the result. And this is the area, 314, which makes sense. Okay, cool. So that's some simple examples. Now, I want to talk about something that you probably already know about, but just in case you don't, I'm going to go through it, and that is the order of operation. Now, this is something you might learn about in school at some point, And it just dictates how we perform calculations when they get a bit more complex, the order of operation, in what order we do these bits of the calculation first. So you might have heard of this, BIDMAS. Let me just type this out. And this is the order we perform the calculations in. First of all, we do any brackets, then any indices, which are these things here, then any division, then multiplication, then addition, then subtraction. So say, for example, we had some kind of complex formula, which is something like this. We'll say let result equal to, and we'll say 5 times, and then in brackets 10 minus 3, and then we'll do to the power of 2. So it's not overly complex, but this right here dictates in what order we perform this calculation. So first of all, B brackets, we perform the bracket calculation. So 10 minus 3 is 7. Then indices, which is this. So then we square it. So 7 squared is 49. Then division, well, we don't have any. Then multiplication, which is this thing over here. So we say 5 times 49, which is 245. So that should be the result. So let's log this to the console and see if we're right. 245, cool. Now let me just comment this out. And what I'm going to do now is create a new variable, and we'll say let likes equal to 10. Now imagine this is the number of likes a particular blog has. Now what if we wanted to add 1 to this likes variable? Well, we could do something like this. We could say likes is now equal to likes plus 1. And if we log out likes, console.log likes, then we should see 11, right? So we do, 11. But there is a shorthand version of this in JavaScript. An easier way to do this is by saying likes plus plus, and that adds 1 to the likes. So if I comment out the first one, then this will run and it will still add 1 to the likes, so we should still see 11. And we do. So that is a shorthand operation there, double plus, and it's the same as adding 1 like this. Now the same can be done for minusing a like, so if I comment this out, I could say likes minus minus, and that takes 1, so it should be 9, and we get 9, cool. Now what if we wanted to add 10? Well, we could do the same thing up here. We could say likes is equal to likes plus 10 this time, but an easier way, a shorthand way, is by saying likes is plus equal to 10. So what that does, plus equal, is take the current value and add on this value. So it's going to take the 10 and add on 10. And if we console out the likes, so console.log likes, save it, and we're doing that twice now, so let's delete one of them. We should see this in the console. We see 20, cool. And the same is true for other things like minus or times or divide. So let's do some other examples. I'm going to comment this out, and this time I'm going to say likes and minus equals 5. So it takes 5 away from it. So let's save that, and we get 5 left, that's right. I'm also going to do a couple more examples. So we'll say likes, and we'll say times equals 2. So that is going to take this value and times it by 2, which is 20, and we get 20. And then finally, let's do divide. So we'll say likes, divide equals 2, and that takes the value 10 and divides it by 2. So we should be left with 5, and we are. Cool. So this here, this is all shorthand notation. It's stuff we can do the long way like this. We say likes equals to likes times 2 or plus 2 or whatever, but this is the quicker way of doing it right here. And when it's just 1, we can use plus plus and minus minus, okay? So that's going to speed things up when we're doing little calculations in the future. All right, so just a couple more things I want to talk about. First of all is not a number, or NaN for short. So it looks something like this, NaN. Stands for not a number. And we get this value when we try to do something that doesn't make sense, some kind of calculation that doesn't result in a number. For example, if I log to the console 5 over hello, that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? We can't do that in real life. And if we do that in JavaScript, we get NaN or NaN. It's not a number. And we can do something else. We could say console.log, and we'll say 5 times hello, and log this to the console, and we get not a number. Surprise, surprise. Okay, so that's one little thing. If you get that, it means you've tried to do some kind of calculation that doesn't result in a number, and you've probably made some kind of error along the way. Okay, Now the final thing I'd like to show you is how to concatenate numbers. So you know, like we said with strings, we can concatenate them with a plus sign. Well, we can do a similar thing with numbers. If we're trying to add some kind of number into a string, we can do that. So let me give you an example. I'm going to say let result equal to the blog has, and then a space, and I'm going to concatenate this with a number. This thing right here, likes. So plus likes, then I'll concatenate with another string, space, likes. So this should say the blog has 10 likes, and it should result in a string. So it takes the 10 and it adds it into the string, and it creates one big gigantic string here. Well, not gigantic, but you get the point. One big string based on all this. So if I now say console.log, the result, we should get that. Let me view in a browser. The blog has 10 likes, okay? Now, this is fine, but if we were to do this with a few different numbers and we had quite a big string, then this would quickly get pretty messy when we're trying to concatenate too many variables with a string. Now, fortunately, there is a new way to do this using template strings, and we're going to see that in the very next video. Okay then, so in this video, I don't want to introduce another data type. I want to take a sidestep and talk about a slightly different version of a string, and that is a template string. And what a template string lets us do is inject variables into the string without having to exit out and using the plus sign to concatenate them. So what I've done is create 3 variables right here, a title, author, and likes. They represent a blog post. And what I'd like to do is create one big string which contains all of these different variables at some point. Now I'm going to show you the concatenation way and the template string way, and you can decide which one you prefer. I much prefer the template string way. By the way, another name for these template strings is a template literal. Okay, so first of all, let's do the concatenation way. So I'm going to create a variable called result and set it equal to a string. Now to begin with, it's going to say the blog called, and then we need to exit out of the string to concatenate the title, so plus title, then back into a string, and we'll say by, then out of the string, and we'll say the author, and then back into the string, and we'll say has, and then out of the string we want the likes, and then finally plus likes, like so. I'm just going to press Control B, and that hides the tree over here for us, so we have more room. And now this is a gigantic string containing all of these different variables. The blog called title, which is this, by author, which is Mario, has 30 likes, okay? So notice how many times we have to come out of the string to concatenate something, then back into the string, then out, then in, then out, etc. This is very, very messy, but it still gets the job done. If I say console.log and then result, we should still see this in the console correctly. The blog called Best Reads of 2019 by Mario has 30 likes. So this works fine. It just looks a bit messy and it's hard to maintain. So then, let's have a look at the template string way. Remember, the job of a template string is to allow us to inject variables directly into the string without coming out of it and having to concatenate with plus signs like this. So again, we'll say let result equal something. Now this time we don't use single quotes, we don't use double quotes, we use backticks. And on a standard keyboard that should be in the top left below the escape button, and they look something like this right here, okay? Little backticks. So this is how we create a template string. Just like we create a normal string using normal quotes like this, a template string is created using backticks, okay? So then inside here we can say something like the blog called, and I'm just going to put title here. We'll come back to this and we'll say by author, again we'll come back to that, has likes. Okay, so what we really want to do is replace these things right here in capitals with the actual variables. Now previously we had to come out of the string and use the plus sign to concatenate them, but in a template string, to output a variable, all we do is $, and then curly braces, open and close, and then we put the name of the variable inside those curly braces. So for example, title, and it should have a different color. Now we'll do the same with author. So $, curly braces, and then author, which is the name of the next variable, then likes. So let's do $, curly braces, likes, and this should all work. And I think that looks a lot better. We don't have to come out of the string and concatenate anything. We just embed the variables directly using this kind of syntax. And it reads a lot better too. So let me now console.log the result to the browser and save it. And we get exactly the same result. This still works. So I much prefer this way, especially when there's many different variables. If it was just one variable and it looks something like this first bit, concatenation is absolutely fine, and I might do that in the future for something like this. But when we have a lot of variables, I'm definitely going to be using template strings. Now then, a good use case for template strings is to create HTML templates. So say for example, we had some kind of dynamic content that we got back from a database, and we want to create an HTML template with that content embedded inside it, then output it to the browser somewhere. Well, we could use a template string for this. So we could say something like let HTML equal to backticks. This is a template string. And then what I'm going to do is enter onto a new line. Now then, I'm going to just create some HTML. So I'm going to say H2, and then I'm going to output the title inside the H2 for the blog. So we'll do our $ curly braces, then close off the H2. Underneath that, we'll do a p tag. And inside the p tag, we want to say by and then the author. So we'll output that and then close off the p tag. And then finally, underneath that, we can say span. And inside here, we'll say this blog has, and then we want to output the likes. So $ curly braces, likes, and then likes. And then close off, oops, it's a span tag, like so. Now then, if we were to log this to the console, we should see all of that HTML string. So if I save it and preview over here in a browser, we can see this HTML string now. And we created that pretty easily using this template string and injecting this dynamic content, okay? So later on, what I'm going to show you how to do is take something like a template like this and output it to the browser somewhere. For now, we'll just use the console, but later we'll see how to output it to the browser. But this is just one use case of using template strings. Okay then, my friends, so far we've seen two different data types, numbers and strings. Now I'd like to talk about arrays, which aren't a new data type in themselves. They fall under the object data type right here, okay? So we typically use arrays to store collections of things in, like a collection of strings or a collection of numbers, something like that. So let's do a few different examples. I'm going to create a variable called ninjas, and I'm going to set it equal to a new array. And the way we do this is by using square brackets, okay? This is array syntax. Now inside this array, I want to have maybe 3 different strings, 3 different names that are all ninjas. So I could create the first one, I'll say Sean. Then I want to add another, so I do a comma and I say Ryu. Then another, so I say comma and then Chun-Li. Now I don't need a comma after the last one, but if I wanted to add another, I just comma separate them all like that. So that there, my friends, is an array with 3 elements or 3 values inside it. We've stored all of those 3 values inside one single variable. So you can probably see already why these are useful for storing collections of data that relate to each other, okay? So let's see what happens if we log this to the console, console.log ninjas. Okay, save that and view it, and we can see this right here, this array. Cool. All right then, so what if we wanted to get just one of these items? Well, we could use square bracket notation. So I could say number 1 inside, and we did this kind of thing with strings when we wanted to get the first position in a string or the 7th position in a string. This is me saying I want to get the first position in the array. And by first, I don't mean the actual first, I mean position 1. Because remember, JavaScript is a 0-based language. We start at 0, then 1, then 2, and so forth. So this right here is saying get the second element. So 0, 1, it should be Ryu. So if we save this, we should see Ryu in the console, which we do. Cool. Now then, what if I wanted to maybe override one of these positions? Say I want to override position 1 with a new value. Well, I could say something like ninjas and then position 1, the same way we get that value, but this time I'm going to set it equal to something new. I'm going to set it equal to Ken. So save this, and this time when we log it to the console, it should be Ken and not Ryu. So that's how we override certain values in different positions inside the array. Okay, cool. Let's do another example. I'm going to create a new array. This one is going to be called ages, and set this equal to 20, 25, 30, and 35. Okay, so we have this array of ages. Now what I'd like to do is just output the third position. So that would be position 2. So we'll say console.log, and we'll say ages, and position 2. This should be 30. Save it, and we can see that right there. So I just created this to show you that we can store different data types inside arrays. These are numbers, these are strings. We're not limited to storing one particular type of data. And if we wanted to, we could mix it up a little bit. We could say something like this. We could say let random equal to Sean for the first element. Then we'll do crystal for the second element. Then for the third element, we'll say 30, then 20. So we're storing two different types inside the same array. Now that might not make much sense because I think arrays should store data which belongs together, and these don't really belong together, but we can still do it. There's nothing wrong with doing it. So let's log this to the console. Random, this will absolutely work, and we see that array right here. Okay, now arrays, like strings and like numbers, they have properties and methods. So let's have a look at some of those. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to comment this out as well. In fact, let's have a look at the length property. So let's say console.log, and we'll say ninjas.length, like so. And lo and behold, this is going to output 3 because it counts how many elements are inside that array, and it counts them. That is the length of an array, how many elements are inside it. Okay, cool. So let's move on to some of the array methods. So I'm just going to do another comment down here that says array methods, and underneath I'm going to do a few different methods. So first of all, let result equal to ninjas, and what I'm going to do is use a method called join, and I'm going to join with a comma. So what this does is take an array, ninjas in this case, and it joins all the elements inside them into a single string, and it joins them with a comma. So after every individual element inside the string, we're going to get a comma. So let me save this, preview. Oops, we need to log it to the console first of all. Console.log the result. Save it, preview, and we can see the string now. It's joined all of the elements together with a comma in between them. If I change this to something like a dash or hyphen, then it's going to change this to a hyphen as well. Now, this hyphen was already part of the name, so don't get confused there. It's only these two hyphens which we've added when we've joined them together in a string. So that's the first method. Now let me show you another one. Again, I'm going to say let result equal to something. This time ninjas.index of, and then we're going to pass in one of the values. So if I pass in Chun-Li, for example, it's going to get me the index of this value inside the array. So again, I'm logging the result to the console. If I save it, we can see number 2. That is the index, 0, 1, 2. Makes sense. Okay, cool. So that's another method. Let's do another. We'll say let result equal to ninjas, and we're going to use a method called concat. And what concat does is take our array and it concatenates another array with it. Okay? So if we want to join two arrays together, we use the concat method. Remember, concatenation is joining things together. So I'm taking this array and we're going to concatenate it with a new array which we pass through as an argument to this method. So just pass an array directly into this method, and in here we'll do two different values, Ken, and we'll do crystal, like so. And we're logging the result to the console. So it should be this concatenated with this array right here in one big array. So let's see. Yep, we can see that. We have 5 elements inside this array now, all here. Cool. Okay, so another method we can use is the push method. So let me say let result equal to ninjas.push. And what the push method does is push on a new value onto the array right here. Okay, so I'm going to push on a new value, Ken, and save this. So if I save it like that and look over here, we can see we get 4 back. Now what this method does is return the length of the new array. Okay, so when we're logging it to the console, it's logging the new length, and since we've just added one, it will be 4 now because it was 3 before. But if now we log out ninjas instead and save it, we can see we now have 4 in. So you know, before when I said that some methods don't alter the original value, well, some methods do, and this is one of them. It alters the original value, and for that reason we call it a destructive method. It doesn't really destroy it, but it changes it. Okay, so then we can also do something called ninjas.pop. So I'm going to say let result equal to ninjas.pop, and again, this is destructive. It changes the original value, and what pop does is take off the end value. So we've just added Ken on, but now we're taking it back off. So when we output it, we should just get the original array. Save it, and we get result has already been defined. So we'll just take off let, save it, and we can see now we get the original array because we popped off Ken. Now what this method does right here is return the value it popped off the array. So if I output now results, we should get Ken because that's the value that was last in the array that we then pop off, and it returns that value. So let's have a look, and voila, we get Ken. So there we go, my friends. That's the basics of arrays. We'll be using them a lot later in the course when we start to work with data collections and loops to output templates to the browser. Alright then, gang, so we've taken a look at numbers, strings, and also arrays. Now I want to turn our focus to null and undefined. Now these two types are quite similar in that they both represent a complete lack of value. The only difference is that null is an intentional lack of value, but undefined isn't. Now that might seem a bit odd when I'm talking about it now, but you'll see exactly what I mean in a minute. So let's do a few examples. First of all, I'm going to create a new variable and I'm going to call that age. Now, I'm not going to set it equal to anything. I'm just kind of setting this variable up, but not assigning it a value yet. Now, what I'm going to do below is console.log 3 things. First of all, the age variable, then age plus 3. Then I'm going to output a template string to say the age is, and then we'll output the age inside that template string. Okay, so what I'm going to do is save this and just run it in the browser over here, and we can see for the first value, undefined. Now it's undefined because we've not given it a value yet. Okay, so that's what happens when we don't give something a value and we try to use it. The browser automatically assigns a value of undefined. It's not intentional. We've not intentionally said let age be equal to undefined. The browser automatically gives it that value when it doesn't have one. Now then, when we try to use undefined in a formula like this, we get not a number. And the third one, when we try to output undefined as a variable inside a template string, we see this. The age is undefined, so we get undefined in the string itself. Okay, so that's undefined. The browser is automatically giving the variable this value because it doesn't yet have one. Now, I said that null was an intentional lack of value, and by that I mean we explicitly say age is equal to null, so we're giving it this empty value of null now. Okay, we didn't do that with undefined, just null. So if I save this now and preview in a browser, now we can see null for the first one. When we try to add 3 to null, we get 3. So when we output null as a value in some kind of formula, it takes on the value of 0. And when we try to output it in a string, it just becomes null inside the string. Okay, so that's null and undefined. Now, I said that null is an intentional value, meaning that we explicitly assign it a value of null. But what's the point in this? Why would we ever really want to do this? Well, an example could be that we have, say, a form on a website which asks for a user's title. Now, when they select the title, for example, Miss or Mrs. or Mr., we store that value in some kind of variable. Now, if at some point the user goes through the rest of the form, but then decides to clear the form, reset it by pressing a button, it clears all the form fields. At that point, we no longer want to store the value of what they selected for the title. For example, Miss, we want to clear it. So at that point, we could explicitly say, well, okay, now the variable title is equal to null. Okay? So that's null and that's undefined. They will be popping up in other lectures as we go forward. Alright then gang, so we've taken a look at quite a lot of different data types in JavaScript so far. Numbers, strings, null, undefined, and also arrays, which is a type of object. Now I want to talk about booleans. Now booleans represent two special values in JavaScript, true and false. So let's have a look at those. So the first thing I'm going to do is console.log true and false. Now these are not strings. Look right here, we've not put them in quotes and they're purple. They're colorized by the text editor because it knows that these are special values. They are booleans. So if I save this and see in the console over here, we can see true and false. Now, if I put these next to actual strings, true and false, these are not the same things. This is a string which just says true, and this is a string that says false. They are not the same as these two things that are not strings. So when we view them in a console, the console helps us out and it colors these a little differently from strings. So we use booleans to evaluate conditions in our code and to check whether certain things are true or false. For example, we can perform some methods on strings or arrays or numbers that are going to return to us a true or false value, a boolean. So let's do a few examples of this. I'm first of all going to say let email equal to Luigi at thenetninja.co.uk. Okay, so now I'm going to use a few different methods on this email thing. So I'm first going to say let result equal to email.includes, and then we're going to look for the at symbol. So this method right here includes, we can use on a string to look if a certain character appears in that string. Now, if it includes that character in the string, this is going to return true. If it doesn't, it returns false. So it returns a boolean either way. Let me log this to the console. I'm going to log the result like so. Save it and preview. And we can see true because it does include that symbol right here. If I instead do an exclamation mark, it's going to return false because it doesn't include that in the string. All right. Okay, so now let me create a new variable called names, set that equal to an array, and we'll put Mario in there, and Luigi, and also Toad. Okay, so we have this array of names. I'm going to come down here and use exactly the same method on this array. So I'm going to say let result, this time equal to names.includes, and we're going to look for a particular value inside this array. So I'm going to look for Luigi. Now this should be true because Luigi is an element inside this array, okay? So when we use this method on an array instead of a string, it looks inside the array and tries to match this value to one of the values inside the array. Now we have to comment this out because we don't want to define result twice. Save it and preview, and we get true because Luigi is inside that array. If I change this to something like Bowser, then it should be false because Bowser is not inside the array. Okay? Alright, cool. So let me comment this out again, and this one. And now what I'd like to do is show you some different comparison operators. So we'd use comparison operators to compare two things together, and they're going to return a boolean true or false. So let's just go through a few examples. I'm going to create an age variable first of all and set that equal to 25. And then I'm going to log something to the console. So we'll say console.log, and inside I'm going to say age is equal, and that's double equals, to 25. Now notice we're using double equals and not single equals right here. Single equals sets a value to something like this. When I use double equals, what I'm doing is saying, are these two things the same? Is age equal to 25? So if age is equal to 25, then this is going to evaluate to true, and we're going to get that true boolean logged to the console. So let me save it and preview, and we see true right here. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is just duplicate these onto a new line, and we're going to just change the condition inside here. So now I'm going to change this to 30. Is age equal to 30? Now that's false, so we should see false over here, and we do. Now let's do another. So I'm going to say is age. Now I'm going to replace the first equal sign with an exclamation. And what this does is negate this. So it says is age not equal to 30. Okay. Now age is not equal to 30. So that's going to be true, this statement. If I change this to 25, then age not equal to 25, that would be false because age is equal to 25. That's a little difficult to get your head around at first, but just remember this right here, this turns it into a not equal. So if these things are not equal, then the statement is true. So if I save it, then we should see true because age is not equal to 25. That statement is true. Okay, so next one. Let's just duplicate this again. And I'm going to say now age is going to be greater than 20. So the greater than sign is that right chevron. And in our case, this is going to be true because age is 25, which is over 20. So let's save it and we get true. Let me duplicate this and change this to less than. And in this case, we're going to get false because age is not less than 20 because it's 25. Okay. All right. So just a couple more. The next one is going to be less than or equal to, and I'm going to change this to 25. So when we add an equal sign after the chevron, no matter whether it's greater than or less than, then this turns it into less than or equal to 25. Now this is going to be true because it is 25. It's not less than 25, but this says less than or equal to. So that should be true. And we get true over here. Okay, one more. Let's just do the opposite of this. We're going to say greater than or equal to 25 and save that. And this statement is true as well. Cool. Okay, so there are a load of different comparison operators we can use right here for comparing numbers. And we're going to do that quite frequently later on. And they all return Booleans. Now, I'm going to do the same kind of thing, but this time I'm going to do it with a string. So I'm going to create a new variable called name and set it equal to Sean, obviously. And then I'm going to come down here and say console.log, and we're going to do a very similar thing. I'm going to say that name is equal to, remember, double equals, Sean. Now, is that the case? Well, yeah, this is Sean. So this statement right here, this should be true. So I'm going to save it, and we see true. Okay, let's do a few more examples. We'll say name is equal to Sean with a capital S. Now, what do you think? Well, this string is not equal to this, is it? Even though it's the same word, we have a capital letter here, and those two things are different in JavaScript. So if I save it now, we should see false, okay? Okay, let's do another example. I'm going to say name is now greater than Crystal. Now, how does this work with strings? Well, first of all, if we save it and preview, we can see that this is true. So it's saying that Sean is greater than Crystal. And that's the case because the first letter right here, S, comes later in the alphabet than C. Now, when that's the case, it's greater than it. So later letters in the alphabet are greater than earlier letters in the alphabet. All right, so what if we added some kind of capital letter to the mix? I'm going to change this to Sean, but we're still doing greater than. Now, is this Sean going to be greater than this Sean? Well, let's save it and find out. This is true. So again, when we have a lowercase letter, that is greater than an uppercase letter. Now, that might seem counterintuitive at first, but that's the case in JavaScript. Lowercase letters are greater than uppercase letters. Okay, so one more example. I'm going to say, is Sean greater than Crystal with a capital C? And I'm going to save it and preview it, and true again. So not only is the small case s greater than its counterpart, the big case S, it's also greater than any uppercase letter. So all of these kinds of comparisons are going to be really useful to us later on when we start to check if certain conditions are true or false, and then execute some code depending on the result of a comparison. So for example, is a user logged in? If that's true, then I'm going to execute some code to show a user dashboard in the browser. If it's not, then I won't. Now, so far when we've compared two things together, to see if they're equal, we've used double equals right here. And that is what's known as abstract equality or loose equality, which means that a value's type is not considered when we perform the comparison. And we're going to talk about that more in the next video and how we can use a stricter and better type of comparison for things like this. Alright then my friends, so in the last video we saw that we could compare different things, and one of those comparisons was this equality right here. So we used double equals to see if two things were the same. So we have a variable age, we've set it to 25, and we're checking if that equals 25. Now obviously this is going to return true. It does. Now this double equal sign right here, this is known as loose comparison, meaning that different types can still be equal. For example, let me duplicate this, and I'm going to see if age, which is the number 25, is now equal to the string 25. So what do you think will happen? Let me save that and preview, and we get true. So JavaScript is saying these two things are equal even though they're different types. And what's happening is behind the scenes, JavaScript is looking at this comparison and it's converting this string into a number, the same type as this, before it evaluates it. Okay? So when we compare two things to each other using a double equal signs, then different types can still be equal because of this type conversion that JavaScript does in the background. So let me just do another couple of examples. I'm going to comment out the first two here, and then up here I'm going to replace these with not equals and not equals, and I'm going to make this a number 25 and this a string 25. So we're saying here age is not equal to 25. Now that would be false because age is 25, and we're saying here age is not equal to the string 25. But remember, the string is converted into a number first of all, so behind the scenes it's still the same thing as this. So this should be false as well. So let me save that and preview, and we get two falses. Okay? So that's fine. We can do this loose comparison using two equal signs, but it's not always the most accurate way of checking something. So most of the time I think it's better to use what's known as strict equality. And we do this by, instead of using two equal signs here, we use three. And instead of one here, we use two. So let's do a few examples. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say console.log age is triple equals to 25. Now this right here, this triple equals, this is strict comparison. So we're saying is age the same value and type to this, okay, 25. Well, yeah, in this case it is, so we should get true, which we do. But if I do another example now and change this to a string 25, then now this should be false because we're checking the type as well. And 25, the number, is not equal to 25, the string. There's no type conversion going on behind the scenes. JavaScript isn't taking this string and converting it into a number before comparing them. Instead, we're comparing the number with the string directly, and they are not equal. So if we save this, then we see false, because really a number can't be equal to a string. Okay, two more examples. This time I'm going to change this to exclamation mark double equals and exclamation mark double equals. We'll change this to a number right here as well, 25. So whereas before we had this and then one equals, now we have that and then two. So this is a strict comparison. Again, it's taking into consideration now the type and not doing any type conversion behind the scenes. So is age not equal to 25? Well, that should be false because age is equal to 25. But is age not equal to the string 25? Well, that's true because we're using strict comparison now, and this is not equal to this. Okay, so let's save it and preview, and we can see false and then true. So false and true, just what we expected. So most of the time it's better to use strict comparison because it results in more predictable results, and probably 99% of the time that's what I'm going to be using going forward. Okay then, so we've seen quite a lot of different types so far. Now I'd like to touch on something called type conversion, and that basically means turning one data type into another data type. And you might want to do this sometimes. For example, we've got a variable here called score, and we've set it equal to 100, but the string 100. Now imagine we wanted to perform some math with that value. We wanted to add 1 to the score, for example, which would be 101. Now if that's a string and we try to add 1, then this is not going to work. We're going to get concatenation whereby the number here is added on to the end, so it becomes 1001. So we're not adding 1 to the value. So it would be nice if we could convert this string into a number type and then perform the calculation. That is type conversion. So then, let me do this. What I'm going to do is grab the score value and we're going to update it by turning it into a number. And the way we do that is by saying number, capital N, and then in brackets we pass in the variable that we want to turn into a number, which is the score. So now we're saying the score is equal to the number version of the score, and that takes this string and it turns it into a number, and that number would be 100. So now when we try to add 1 to the score, because it's a number now, we've converted it, now it should be 101. So let's test that out. Now we get 101. Cool. Okay, so that's a simple type conversion. And by the way, you can check the type of something by using the type of operator. So let me just do that, console.log, and I'm going to say type of, all one word, then a space, then the variable that we want to check the type of. So we want to check the type of score. I'm going to save that, and we're going to see that this is a number. Now, if I just comment out this line, so we're not turning it into a number, then it should be string, because originally it was a string up here, okay? Okay, cool. So let's move on. Now, what if we have a new variable called result and we want to set that equal to a string? What if we want to try converting this into a number? Well, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Let's try it. So number, and then we pass in the value that we want to turn into a number. I'm going to log down here the result like so and save it. So if we come over here, we can see now not a number. So if we try to take something that doesn't really make sense to turn into a number and try to use this right here to turn it into a number, then we're going to get not a number as a result. Okay? All right then, so let's try it the other way around. What if we want to take a number and turn it into a string? Well, let's say let result equal to, this time, string with a capital S, and then we're going to pass in a number. I'm going to pass in 50. And I'm going to save it and come over here and we can see 50. Now, how do we know that this is actually a string and not a number? Well, first of all, when we type in a number in the console, it comes out as blue, but that's shady logic. We can use the type of operator down here. We can say type of, and then we'll put the result there. So every time we do some kind of conversion, we're outputting the result and the type of that result variable. So if I save, we can see that 50 and string. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to take this and convert it into a string, right? Okay, so let's move on. Let's do another example. We can also convert things into booleans. Remember, booleans are those things true or false. So we could say let result equal to boolean and then pass in something like 100. Now, what do you think this is going to do? Well, if I save this and come over here, we get true and the type is boolean. So when we do this type of conversion in JavaScript, when we try to make something into a boolean, some values are considered true and others false. Now you might hear them being called truthy or falsy values. And this right here, this 100, this is a truthy value. But if I try 0 and save it, then we get false. So 0 is a falsy value. Okay, so positive numbers are considered a truthy value in type conversion. Minus numbers are also truthy, but 0 is false. Okay, now let's do another example. I'm going to come down here and say again, let result this time equal to a boolean, and it's going to be the string 0. So what's this going to be? We know that this is a falsy value, normal 0, but what about a string of 0? Well, let's come over here. We can see this time it's true. Now, strings of any length, they are all truthy. But if we make it an empty string of no length, then this would be falsy. Okay? We can see false now. So this is all explicit type conversion, meaning we've explicitly tried to convert the types, right? Now, there's also something called implicit type conversion, which JavaScript does behind the scene. We saw that in the last video when we talked about loose comparison. JavaScript changed the type of our values behind the scene before comparing them. And that will come into play in other areas too in the future. For now, though, it's enough just to understand that we can convert types either ourselves, explicitly like this, or implicitly behind the scene.